Greetings, friends. I'm going to attempt to show how models can blind us from reality. The philosopher Jean Baudrillard is useful. I studied some of his writings in university. He's kind of a lot of nonsense, but he did have some points. And from this website here, I was reading a good introductory summary. According to Baudrillard, what has happened in postmodern culture is that our society has become so reliant on models and maps that we've lost all contact with the real world that preceded the map. Reality itself has begun to merely imitate the model, which now precedes and determines the real world. So he's saying that models are now preceding the real world. Models are now determining the real world. The territory no longer precedes the map, nor does the territory survive the map. It is nevertheless the map that precedes the territory, what he calls the procession of simulacra. Now, he's a postmodernist. He doesn't believe in absolute truth, as far as I know, and I would disagree with him there, but he does describe the contemporary situation. People are unmoored and are often struggling for any basis in reality, and the younger generation is caught up increasingly in the virtual world to the point where they won't ultimately care. Even if they knew that something was not real, it wouldn't make much of a difference for them. Such is the world we're headed for when they make these headsets that you'll put on and you'll be in this virtual world. Now, these models do come crashing down. Reality does destroy them eventually, but the scary thing is how far these models can go without being brought into line with reality. As it goes today, we develop models to predict how some event will play out, how things will occur. The model is not supposed to replace reality, but we come to be blinded by these models increasingly. They take on a life of their own. It becomes perhaps more sophisticated. It grows its own culture, so to speak. It develops a counterfeit logic of its own, even though it's becoming detached from the truth. So the more effective models, even though that they are greatly out of touch with the truth, they are able to persist for many years or generations, perhaps, because they do involve some of the truth. Like a good lie, you must tell some of the truth to be believable. The scientific method is: number one, form a question; number two, make a prediction; number three, gather data; number four, analyze the data; number five, draw conclusions. This is the scientific method. So when people say follow the science, they're often not thinking of that actual process. What are some more specific examples to illustrate this? So the first example would be COVID. We were told that the virus would kill this many people at this rate. There were different variation of models. These models were taken extremely seriously by the media, by the government. They were unquestioned largely, and they were allowed to justify extreme measures by the state and by corporations together to limit civil liberties, to impose all kinds of unheard of restrictions and demands upon the populace, and ultimately to institute some medical policies at an unprecedented scale. These were continuously, for months, reinforced by mathematical models and projections of the seriousness of a virus which ended up having a survival rate of approximately 99.8%. Now, there was so much controversy over the nature of this virus. It's not important to get into the weeds over it, but basically, the common person, without doing mountains of research on their own, but just by going about their daily life, would be able to observe that, yes, very well, there's something that was affecting people and killing some people, but the fact that we focused on something which is killing people at a similar rate to how other viruses and other social ills kill people every year, the fact that we focused on that with such fervor and with all this related behavior and impositions, and it really wasn't the model, of course. Power, that's not how power works, but power uses this model, and many people believe in the model, and so it plays its role to justify this sort of complete detachment from reality, this insanity. And it went on and on and on, and eventually things were reevaluated, but no one was really held accountable for these models, which is why they could easily come back again. And many people still believe the models and still believe that this virus was much, much more deadly than it was. And most of them are someone who knew someone who died or someone who worked as a nurse, even though the nurses were very compromised by what they did, and all the institutions were compromised. But because there's lots of truth on the other side, they focus on the truth, which is fair enough, because they've seen that people did get sick from something, but they're focused on that, and therefore you don't get a balanced perspective at all. So the second case would be India's moon landings. It was in the news some months ago that India landed a robot on the moon, and all we saw was just computer animation. Now, there was something that looked like it might have been a real video of a rocket landing on perhaps what was the moon, but it never was entirely clear what these images were that we were being presented. But most of them were obviously recreated images. And as the weeks went by and the story got older, but there was still discussion of it going on, we would be referring back to more of these images, which perhaps are based on real data. Maybe something went up into the atmosphere. Maybe something actually went there. Even if something actually went to what they say is the moon up there, what are we really processing here other than pixels, some numbers, radio signals? I mean, yes, I guess that's real. Is that physically real? In some sense, it's physically real, but we're not having a direct access to that in the sense that empiricists of the 18th century would have thought of verifying things as being real. It's like stamping your toe on a rock and verifying that it's real, and that's at a much more basic order than radio waves, numbers, and things like that. That's even based on if this is true. That we would expect better quality data. We would expect more photographs, more actual video. We would expect more of a continuing feedback of what's going on once this thing gets to the moon. Well, apparently it just goes to sleep. We're continuously seeing these computer animated videos describing supposedly a real event, and yet maybe the funding's going to increase for this thing. Maybe the more hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever rupees are going to be spent. Whatever other international organizations might contribute to India's space program. Maybe this is a big success. It is a big success, a big publicity success, national pride for India, taking its place among the world powers to doing this. So the model of how, when I say model, I mean maybe more genuinely describing what the spacecraft did, where it went, how it operated, the craft itself, the logistics, all of that model and those predictions can easily be tweaked. They can easily be presented in a way to show that everything's successful, that something indeed happened, when what actually happened is beyond us. So that would be my second example. My final example would be the Ukraine war. So they predicted that Ukraine would take over a large portion of territory that Russia had taken during its counteroffensive, as they called it, which began on the 4th of June. But that counteroffensive failed, and yet you will never have a shortage of people telling you that it's still working. I mean, maybe now they finally admitted, but you'll never have a shortage of different ways to interpret what's going on the battlefield. Because as soon as you can find someone advancing in one direction here on one side, if you search hard enough, you can find some other place where the other side is making an advance. So you'll always find something to balance it out in your models and your predictions, and they'll show arrows. They'll show arrows like this is our model. This is our prediction of how the Ukrainian army is going to come in here and cut the Russian forces in two. They're going to be isolated in Kherson, and Crimea is going to be isolated. And we're going to go through back to the Sea of Azov and cut them off. And because we have this new technology, we have all the HIMARS missiles from the United States, and the German tanks, the Leopards, and the Abrams, and all the other things. Then eventually they're going to get F-16s, even though F-16s are like decades old and outdated now. But still, you can put it into the model, you can put it into your computer, and you can show reality. And in fact, I was mentioning maps at the beginning of this. The maps are different, according to different websites, based on different calculations, different standards for how they interpret what is actually going on. Now, again, these things are brought back in line with reality sooner or later. That does happen. In this case, those people are going to be forced sooner. But then you will always find people that will justify things as being the complete opposite of what your direct senses can tell you. So when it comes back to the scientific method here, forming the question, making the prediction, gathering data, analyzing the data, and drawing conclusions, I feel what happens is people get stuck between steps 2 and 3, so they're making predictions and they're gathering data, but they might be analyzing the data. They're sort of not drawing conclusions, or if they are drawing conclusions, it's more just it's just a prediction of what they want to happen, or what they always have thought based on some pre-rational thinking. The model is an example of how people try to control reality, explain things materially, scientifically, and completely lose touch with the real because they thought that they could control it through means which are beyond them. Hasta luego, amigos.